This is Spike. I'm Jimmy. And we're going to go over stuff like this. You see here, this is Envirotex Light. We're going to go over Bondo, Epoxies, and cyanoacrylate glues, and a couple of other things. This is Jimmy Tips, episode 8. I like that. He likes that. That belly scratch. I want to do some tips about Bondo. I've been using Bondo for quite some time, for cars of course, but then also for a lot of model making and prop making. I talked about this in my hot glue tips video. Whenever I mix Bondo, I use a round stick. Always find a piece of scrap wood that could be a dedicated mixing palette. Get a dollop. I'm going to mix a small amount because it's very stinky. Mix up your hardener. Sometimes it becomes separated in the can. And of course, the more hardener you use, the quicker it'll cure. Also, the temperature. If it's hot out, it'll cure quickly. If it's cold out, it'll cure slowly. But having a round stick gives me the ability to kind of mush it a lot easier. I know a lot of people like to use the spatula, but the one thing I don't like is having unmixed Bondo on my tool. I make sure all the Bondo on the palette is mixed completely and also on the stick so that everything continues to cure and that there's no unhardened Bondo anywhere. Now I clean my stick off by spinning it. If I'm using these applicators, these plastic ones from Bondo, now there's all kinds of techniques of applying it to the material. That's another video. I always clean my palette completely off so there's nothing. There's no trace of any bumps. If you have two of these and they end up with like bits of Bondo all over them, I mix up the Bondo and I try and stick them together. I'll do like that, or I'll even stick this to a piece of sacrificial cardboard. So once it cures, I peel it and it doesn't stick to this, but all the mess stays stuck on the cardboard. It would have worked better if I had two that were the same size. And then by letting it completely stick together, I'm able to pull one completely off the other. And then I have a pretty big piece to pull off of this one. And this stuff tends to pull off. When you have hardened Bondo on metal tools, just like this, even if it sat in the drawer for a year, we typically do this. You heat it up. You don't want to overheat it to the point where you're flexing the metal. You just want to heat the Bondo up, and then with another tool, it peels it right off the metal. Magic Sculpt is 2-part epoxy clay. You mix the color part, in this case we have white or like a dark brown, with the hardener side. So just like epoxies that I've talked about, you mix these two parts together, equal amounts, you stir them together. The way I like to mix them is I roll them into little tubes like that, and then I flip them on themselves, and then I roll them into another little tube. That's a great way, and then twist it, roll it between your hands, flop it, twist it. It becomes hard plastic, and it's great for repairing wood. They sell a kit where it's something like Bondo for repairing rotted wood or making up spaces in awkward shapes. This stuff does the same thing. It's epoxy clay, and this particular brand is called Magic Sculpt. And I get it at a website called sculpt.com. And to show you something I made with it, I sculpted this helmet in styrofoam, and then I gave it a skin of the Magic Sculpt, about 1/8 of an inch thick, all over. And I was able to get some more details in it. It's water soluble, so you could wash it up really quickly with water, or when you put it in place, you could smooth it out with water. Want some cat shoes? So that's Magic Sculpt. Check it out, it's great stuff. So this is a wood glue bottle from our shop, and years ago I developed a habit that works for me. As soon as I get these bottles, I pull this off, and then I cut this off. And then I just leave it like that. I use these bottles up so much that it doesn't bother me that I can't close this. If I needed to, I could stick a little plug in there or a golf tee. With this traditional top, it just gets clogged way too often to deal with. So I never use it that way. This is a bottle we bought on a job, and we used it up right away that day. So this bottle didn't get the treatment yet.
It works great if you close it right away.
It never works if you close it right away.
It works fine. If you close it when you're done, it's fine.
No, it doesn't. I'll talk a little bit about CA or cyanoacrylate, or however you say it, basically crazy glue. It comes in thin, medium, and super thick. It's to kind of stay in the joint that you're trying to glue together. These are new bottles, but as you use them, it gets harder and harder to put the cap back on. Even though you try to keep it clean, it becomes more and more difficult to the point where we just end up leaving it open like that. If you start with a bottle of thin, as you leave it open, it starts to become thick. It starts to cure up. So we always end up having to cut the top open again and again and put a stick in there. When you end up with a bottle like this, the top is glued completely on. I end up doing something like this. I'll just cut the corner off and then I get in the bottle that way. So just a little trick to get in the bottle when there's still some good stuff in there. I think it's really important if you're going to use any of these and you start fiddling with the top like this and you're working on a project, always wear protective goggles, because this stuff, even just a little drop gets in your eye. It's difficult to fix that. Whenever you see crazy glues available, whether it's a hobby shop or a wood shop, they sell a kicker with it. You put a little dab of glue down and then you spray it. Creates a chemical reaction and it makes the CA glue dry right away. It usually dries it from the outside in, so you got to kind of let it wait a minute. I'm going to show you a quick trick from my model making days. This represents a broken cable cuff. We'll put it in place and connect it. And now you don't have a good clean joint there, but what we're going to do is we're going to use baking soda and crazy glue to build up that gap. This stuff works as a gap filler. You pour some glue right in there. It's probably going to glue to the table. And then you put a little bit of baking soda in there. And the baking soda activates the crazy glue and creates sort of this thick bond. Of course, crazy glue has a fume. And that fume will stain acrylic, it'll stain glass, and it'll also kind of poison you. So watch out for that fume. That fume really kicks off when you put baking soda on there. You see it kind of has a really strong reaction. You sometimes might even see some smoke coming off of that. Yeah, so don't get over that fume, because that will shock your nostrils. And then once that dries, it actually dries fairly instantly. But once you're confident that it's nice and strong, you could sand it and file it, and you get a nice, really good, strong joint there again. There we are. We're back to new. Dude, how'd you get that hump on your back?
What hump?
Jet acrylic. Let's talk about it. Jet acrylic is a powder that you solidify with the liquid hardener. If you've gone to the dentist, you've smelled this. If you've ever gotten like a temporary crown, the doctor makes it out of this. It comes in colors. It comes in pink, that kind of mimics the gum color, and then it comes in white, which mimics the teeth color, and then you could shade it. It's great for making fillet joints when you're doing acrylic and styrene. You put the powder where you want it, and then you dab the acrylic on there. It makes a very, very strong joint. And here I was just experimenting, and I took this steel tube and I put it down on top of this Bondo cup. I poured some powder in it, I put a little resin drops in it, and I was able to make a bottom for this. Now that bottom is about 1/8 of an inch thick. It's really strong at the moment, and it's going to get stronger. So now I have a full bottom to that, airtight, and I'm sure it's watertight as well. So I was able to cap the bottom of that steel tube with jet acrylic. This stuff has a lot of applications. It's just, it's up to you as the inventor to figure out what you're going to do with it. And this joint is really strong. I just know from experience that this stuff works really good. And if you pour it into like a silicone mold and you end up with a chunk of it, you could machine that chunk and you have a nice strong acrylic shape in the shape of whatever you want. You could also put this into silicone molds. It pops right out. Makes nice hard chunks. This is often I cut my hands in the workshop, and sometimes it's a cut that isn't so bad that I need to run to the emergency room. So I use crazy glue and I use thread to close those cuts up. There's a scar I got from a spinning grinding wheel right there on my finger. There's actually a picture of this cut in my Instagram. I typically take a medium type of crazy glue and I put a dab of it out on a bottle cap usually, because the bottle cap is polypropylene and the crazy glue doesn't really soak into it. Then I take a thread and I just soak the thread in the crazy glue. Then I wrap the cut with the thread. My finger looks like a ham going in the oven. And I just keep getting crazy glue on that string. And this is a way that I can close the cut and not get it filled with crazy glue. Let's say, for instance, I cut the palm of my hand. And of course it's a bit messy because you'll be bleeding. Just try and get one in place. Soak that string in crazy glue. Get another one in place. In an old episode of Trash to Cash, I fixed a cut on John's hand. He cut himself prying open a paint can. So you see, I'll let the glue dry on that, and then I'll be able to pull the cut shut. You start to get some relief before you get to the hospital. I've done this probably 40 times in my life where I was able to close cuts with thread and crazy glue. So if you're like me and you have no health insurance, get yourself a spool of thread and a bottle of crazy glue. And you're good to go.
Why don't you hold it shut with that Rolex?
The Rolex is a one-time buy. This is Envirotex Light Pour-On High Gloss Resin, and it gives you a nice thick finish. You could trap things in the finish. You can pour something about the 1/8 thick. Most important is while it's been sitting, the material has separated. So make sure that you at least stir the bottles a little bit. Even though they mix together in and of themselves, they should also be mixed. So you see the bubble floating. Mix them in equal amounts. How do you know you're pouring equal amounts in the same cup? I usually just give myself a measurement on the stick. So now the stick has 1 inch and 1 inch, and when I pour it into the cup, I could see where 1 inch is and where 1 inch is. This stuff tends to go a little bit yellow when it's old. That's why you can see the one part of it is kind of yellow. A lot of people get concerned that you're basically whipping this up, filling it with air bubbles, but don't worry about that because we can get those out in a second. When you pour over something, you want to make sure all these objects basically stay below the surface. You know, if you're going to put objects in it, you want to make sure they stay below the surface. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll pour one small coat just to trap things at the base or at the bottom of the trough. Let it settle, let it find its path. Sometimes you pour it in the corner and then let it even out. So I'm going to pour just that much and then let it settle. If you're going to have objects in it that could float, you could either hot glue them in place before or just do one thin coat and let it trap all the objects, and then the following day do the finished coat so all the objects stay trapped at the bottom. This is just a piece of wood with just some thin furring strips hot glued around it, just as a sample. And in some of my videos, people have seen me use a torch, and what the torch does is it helps pop the bubbles because the heat expands in the bubbles and then they pop. Pour some more in. It's really important that the trough you make for it is completely watertight. If your trough is not watertight, it will have all night long to leak out. You just need a little amount of heat. You're not trying to burn the surface, just a little bit of amount. Even a hairdryer will do. Now I'm waiting for those bubbles to come to the surface, and as they come to the surface, I'll keep heating it to pop the bubbles. But even if I just let it sit, the bubbles will all float to the surface and pop. This won't be ready until tomorrow. And with this material, if you have a problem with it, for instance, I have a cat hair in there. This is one of Spike's hairs. If you have a problem with it or you find that some of it didn't cure, scrape it out and don't be overly concerned. You could palm sand the whole face of this and give it one thin brush coat and it brings it right back to clear. There's lots of brands. Some brands boast that they never go yellow. Some brands dry quicker than others. So there's lots to choose from. Check out my friends at sculpt.com. They have all different types of material that do this. Hey, bud. What are you doing? Whenever I mix epoxy, I typically mix it on top of this painter's tape so I can just peel it off and throw it right away. When you're doing a lot of epoxy, it's good to remix on a clean surface each time. This is a little gimmick I often do when you have the two bottles for 5-minute epoxy. I keep them taped together so that I always know where they are. And I just tilt over one bottle and then tilt over the second bottle. And again, I like to use these bamboo skewers that you get at the supermarket. Just like I talked about mixing the Bondo, I like to be able to roll the stick underneath it and twist it through it. I find that that's the best way to get it mixed. Just twist it through it. Now a lot of epoxies are basically the same. We have West System, which I use a lot. This stuff is good. They use it on boats, so it's kind of waterproof and it's reliable. You use that with a fiberglass mesh and you get a really good surface. But the West System also makes this powder for filling and blending. And this particular powder, number 405, actually is sort of the color of wood. You mix it into the epoxy. I use it either with the West System or with just regular 5-minute epoxy. And you get a nice wood putty. You also get a thicker epoxy if you're trying to do either a fillet or if you want to keep it in place. Say you're filling holes that are on a vertical surface, they won't run if you have them mixed with a little bit of filler. If you're going to use a very specific color, you could save some of the sawdust from your palm sander and mix it in here. Then you have an accurate color to the wood that you're working with. And a trick too is keep it spread really thin and then you get a little bit more working time with it. Keep it clumped together and it kicks off a little quicker. If it's hot out, it will kick faster no matter what. If it's cold out, it will kick slower. You can keep them in the refrigerator. If you take them out cold, you have a lot more working time. Even though it's 5-minute epoxy, it takes longer because it's cold. Sometimes when you're on a job site, you have these 5-minute epoxy tubes you got to get from a hardware store. If it's a cold day, it's hard to push out. We've actually put them inside of these things just to force out the epoxy on a cold day. These bottle applicators, most often they never come out at the same time, so we typically just cut that in half with a razor blade. So now you have 2 independent plungers. This actually gives you more control. This is a nice idea in theory, but it never comes out evenly, and you find yourself fiddling around with this. Just cut it in half and plunge them separately, and just give yourself even amounts. If you have an epoxy joint that's like wood to metal or metal to metal with epoxy, a simple way to alleviate that joint, if you need to open it, put a little heat on there, and it lets it go immediately. This is methylene chloride for gluing polystyrene, and when you use the hypodermic bottles, which you're supposed to use, I always just put a little bit in there. See that? Just a little bit so that you could squeeze the air out of it, and then when you turn it over, it will inhale, give it a little, let it inhale some air, and then when you need the glue, you give it a squeeze. And then you let it inhale air. Because every one of those drips is going to leave a stain on your project or on your sheet of plexiglass or whatever it is you're gluing. So you want to control it. You only want to put it exactly where you want it. And then you let the bottle inhale. If you fill this completely up, it's going to be difficult for you to control what comes out of the end of that bottle. Methylene chloride glue is specifically for styrene and ABS. It doesn't work on anything else. It is like a welding agent. What it does is it gets between those two surfaces and melts the contacting surfaces and then evaporates. So it literally welds the plastic together. When you buy a new can of methylene chloride, it evaporates. So I never open the tip up all the way. I always just puncture a hole. So what that actually is doing is melting those two surfaces that are in contact. When you glue styrene with methylene chloride, the longer you wait, the stronger the joint will become. Initially, it's a bit gummy. If you want to sand this joint nice and clean and make it invisible, you really have to make sure that this stuff is all evaporated and the joint is cured. Usually takes about an hour at least. I think too much evaporated. What's up, buddy? This is Lexel. This is the glue I used in the Brompton sign video where I glued the plexiglass to the metal. And this and something called goop, it comes in shoe goop, this goop, boat goop, car goop. It's all the same. So whatever one you see, it's basically the same material. It's a really good glue that works between all dissimilar surfaces. It has a bit of a fume, and it goes back to something Dave and I always say, that the dizzier you get while you're applying it, the stronger the joint's going to be.